All right. Well, welcome everyone officially to the 2020 Montana International Educators Conference. We are super excited to be hosting the first ever virtual MIEC conference here in Montana. And even though we're in the middle of a global pandemic and it's brought us together here virtually instead of in person, perhaps we'll find some advantages to this online platform that will set a new precedent as we move ahead. I have to say, Missoula is especially beautiful and magical here in June, and I wish that you could be here to see it, but hopefully in the future we'll be able to experience it together here in person. I want to start by saying thank you to this year's MIEC conference organizer, Bodie Murphy. Bodie has been working on this conference probably since before I joined UM back in August. And anyone who has put together a conference knows it requires a tremendous amount of work and coordination. And I appreciate all Bodie has done to make this year's conference possible in spite of all of the hurdles. I also want to give a special thanks to Caroline McLean and the entire GEO team, international PhD students Sophia Rice and Li Qing Tang, Adria Lawrence, Susan Harper Whalen, and John Matt in the College of Education, as well as the NAFSA Region 2 team. Without your support and encouragement, this year's conference absolutely would not have been possible, so thank you. Although we gather today for this conference in a virtual space, I want to acknowledge that the University of Montana stands in the Aboriginal territories of the Salish and Kalispel people, whose land was forcefully taken from them through colonization. We honor the path they have always shown us in caring for this place for the generations to come. So as I said about preparing these opening remarks, I started by thinking about where we were just 6 months ago. What was the state of international higher education coming into 2020? Well, in recent years, we've witnessed a rise in the level of nationalism in many countries with tightened immigration policies and stronger governmental oversight of research collaborations. At the same time, competition among countries and universities from international students has increased significantly, which we all know. And at the same time, the demographics of young populations in many countries are shifting. The onset of a historic global pandemic with its serious travel challenges and dramatic economic effects raises yet another threat to the future of internationalization on US campuses. So here's what has happened globally just in the last few months. More than 200 million higher education students have been unable to attend classes on their campuses. Approximately 70% of international students return to their home countries, while 30% stayed abroad, many times facing significant challenges, especially around housing and finances. Only 60% of teaching has been transferred to remote delivery. That surprised me actually, which means 40% of students are experiencing a significant learning deficit. There was a survey of US college presidents conducted last month by the American Council on Education, ACE. And it showed that most pressing issues facing US college presidents due to COVID-19 were urgent matters such as enrollment numbers for summer and fall, deciding what the plans are for the fall term, how are they going to reopen or are they going to reopen, long-term financial viability of the institution, furloughs, or reducing salaries. The first item related to anything international appeared at number 11 on the list, and that was international student enrollment. So what this says is that college presidents right now are thinking about the urgent, and they're delaying the important because they have to focus on the urgent. So how does that translate? Some consequences of COVID-19 on international higher education include, or likely will include, diminished enrollment of international students globally, impact to institutional budgets, financial implications impacting staffing of international education offices, and risk of diminishing interest in international engagement. So last month, we went from one pandemic to another. But unlike COVID-19, this pandemic did not appear unexpectedly. This is something that has been here all along. And the murder of George Floyd at the hands of Minneapolis police last month was a tipping point that triggered an overdue awakening to systemic racism in America. It started in Minneapolis, grew throughout the US, and within a week it had spread to international protests and calls for real change. Many of the significant inadequacies of higher education have become more explicit in the wake of COVID-19, and also as we are reminded of the role higher education has played in perpetuating systemic racism in America. Likewise, many of the long-held assumptions about international education are also being challenged within these contexts and realities. And it's time for us as international educators to also question these assumptions. For example, there is a long-held assumption that mobility equals internationalization. We have a unique opportunity right now to mainstream internationalization into the core work of our institutions, to assure that all students, regardless of their ability to pay or travel, will have access to global engagement here at home. Tony Ogden, who's a former SIO at University of Wyoming and now is with Gateway International Group, talks about integrated international education, focusing on providing equitable access to international learning and engagement for all learners by intentionally integrating international expectations into the curricula and life of the institution. He says institutions that are able to broaden their focus beyond mobility education to consider other dimensions along the continuum of internationalization will be better positioned to respond to the shifting demands of this new era of higher education. I would posit another assumption we make is that international diversity equals diversity in the US. How are we preparing our international students and scholars of color, for example, to face the realities of what it means to be a person of color in the US? We cannot assume that they will not be subject to discrimination and bias, nor that they will have an understanding of the deep history and complexities of race in America. So how can higher education institutions develop new policies and practices that respond to both the problems and the opportunities resulting from this unprecedented crisis? How do higher education institutions remain global in an age of nationalism and with the added challenge of living in a post-COVID-19 era? Internationalization remains a vital, critical part of higher education, but how we approach and implement it needs to adapt and change. It's upon us as international educators to take the actions necessary to establish those new norms. We're called to take action at this critical moment. So, for example, we must work to assure equity and inclusion is happening in international education. How do we make a commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion that will last? We know that what is important in our institutions gets measured. How will we measure our efforts toward equitable access to international education at our institutions? Joe Biden once said, "Don't tell me what you value. Show me your budget and I'll tell you what you value." How do we reflect our commitment to equity and inclusion in our budgets? How can we utilize COIL, which is Collaborative Online International Learning, and virtual exchange to increase access to international education for students who are unable to participate in programs that require international travel? How can we make sure students have equitable access to the internet and software needed to engage in virtual options? We also need to make a commitment to providing socially responsible internationalization. This includes incorporating practices that are socially and environmentally just. What impact do our program models, our frequent air travel, and our business practices have on the communities we work with around the world? How can we do better. It is now our time to move beyond our comfort zone. How do we innovate to provide broadened access to all students? How do we increase the use of COIL and virtual exchange? In addition to mobility-based programs to increase access for students. We really need to double down on curriculum integration and get beyond embedding international education values in only the usual suspects such as business, humanities, and social sciences. How do we ensure a global perspective is present in all disciplines? We must continue to refine the link between international education and skills. So look at the dispositions needed by our graduates. Look at how many of those are addressed by international education. How many of those are connected to curricular and co-curricular experiences and connected to institutional student learning outcomes. We need to make the case that internationalization is a means to our campus goals and student learning outcomes, not just a goal in and of itself. Finally, international education really does matter more now than ever. We have many global problems to solve right now, from the pandemic to immigration to environmental cases. These are borderless issues. They are everyone's problems that require collaboration across borders to solve. So as you move through the next 2 days, please take advantage of the time and space provided by this conference to explore these questions with each other. My hope really is that these ideas have piqued your interest, even in a time when we are all feeling personally and professionally fatigued. Give and take energy, hope, encouragement from one another as colleagues who share a mission and a passion. And again, welcome and enjoy the conference.